Welcome back to another episode of GSD Talks, brought to you by Inside Access Control. Very excited. This is episode number 2. We're going to continue the conversation around leadership and professional development. So, Tim, why don't you give the listeners an overview of who did we talk to and what did we talk about?
Well, episode 2, we had Ron Worman from the Sage Group on. He's a really great help to the industry. He's not himself in security, but he's a business helper. And the crux of what we're going to talk about today is the value proposition of being security within an organization. How do we demonstrate that to the business, and how do we think about it not as security professionals, but as business professionals who happen to be in security?
And what I love about Ron is he brings that business knowledge and some of those business practices, lean principles, Six Sigma approach. And what I loved about this conversation is we dove kind of deep into how you could practically apply some of those to security and really reframe and repurpose your security organization, integrate it with the business, get a seat at the table with the other business leaders. And I think Ron had some great ideas on how someone could really take away from this conversation and go apply them immediately.
Sounds like a great episode. I'm looking forward to hearing it myself, and I appreciate you both taking the time to introduce Ron and the conversation. So thank you.
Wow, GSD Talks episode 2 with Ron Worman. Thank you for coming on, Ron. Why don't you introduce yourself?
My name's Ron Worman. I'm the founder and managing director of a strategic consultancy called the Sage Group. And how it intersects with the risk, resilience, and security industry is I also produce the great conversation.
Yeah, I have a little bit of experience with Ron. As he will tell you, he stalked me for a few years trying to, get me to collaborate with him. I don't see it that way. I see it as our schedules were always missing. But last year at GSX, we actually were able to collaborate on a panel. We had an excellent panel, and he's a deep thinker. So I think what's really interesting for myself about Ron is he's not in the security industry. He's not a security professional. He's more of that business consultant that's been working with the security industry to help propel it forward down the path to becoming a profession, which I really love. So we kind of had a few talks preparing for this, and I kind of want to tell a story that I think will illustrate the conversation for today. Once upon a time, I took over a few security programs that were considered broken. And as we were getting everything back up and running and things were going better, I had a talk with the people involved, the people on the team, and I said, hey, how are we going to measure success going forward? I want you to own your roles, even though I'm the manager. But how are we going to measure this success going forward? And one of the leaders of the group said, well, we're not in trouble, so I think we're good. And that is reflective in my mind of the security industry as a whole. Hey, right now we're not in trouble, so we're good. We're not in trouble, so obviously we're valuable. And I don't know, Ron, John, what do you think? Is that a sustainable way for the industry?
Short, easy answer is no. And I think it should be a full stop there, right? I think that there's no way that our industry can sustain itself on approaching the absence of crisis as the positive indicator of success. And especially if you look at the situation that we're in today, 2 dynamic, unbelievable crisis moments, both the pandemic and then the civil unrest and rioting and just racial tension that's overtaking the U.S. These are moments that we have the opportunity to show the immense value of what our industry is capable of doing. And so I think it's the moments like this where we can show value, and then the tame moments where we continue to show the value. But that's my take, Ron, but love to hear your thoughts too.
Great fears. 2 great truths. The first truth is change is the only constant we have in life. And the second truth is most of us are scared to death of that truth.
Very true.
So we end up holding on to things that represent normal to us. So it's a very, very good answer, John, that you and Tim both receive in this environment, that Jim Collins kind of crystallized in his book, Good to Great. You know, good is the enemy of great. We're not out to disrupt things that aren't broken yet. Why change, right? But if change is the only constant, and you have a different mental framework around that constant, then you're always trying to disrupt. You're not relying on just your CPP to define what should be, but you're looking for ways to disrupt what you already know. Does that make sense?
It does, and I really enjoy what you both said. We do find ourselves in a time right now, you know, we're kind of on the tail end of the COVID thing, at least the tail end of anybody caring about it. And now we have all this civil unrest going on across the nation, and this should be the time that, you know, security departments are hired for, right? But how often does this happen?
Yeah.
It doesn't actually happen very often. So my question to you, Ron, is how do we foster that perception of value within the business the other 93% of the time?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, Tim, I think you know, and you got from that one time we served on a panel together, and you see when I'm doing the great conversation, is I treat the risk, resilience, and security professionals as business people, not as security people. In fact, I open up my conferences many times by saying, I've got good news for some of you and bad news for some of you. And the good news is, I think the good news is you're in the information management business. You're not in the security business. Security is a domain within that business, but you're in the information management business. And why do I say that? Well, let's go back to your opening, Tim. And by the way, I talk to business people like this too, so I'm treating you as one of my business clients, right?
Just don't send me a bill, please.
I remind people that the notion of strategic business value is the goal and the language of the CEO, right? Strategic business value. The value equation is the management of risk and opportunity, right? You can almost see that as an equation. Risk and opportunity equals value, right? So that's the CEO language. The language of the CEOs around strategic value. What most business people don't know is that the executive management team is the United Nations. There should be a Berlitz translator right in the middle of that table, because when I coach CEOs and their teams, I tell them each one of you speak a different language. CFO speaks a totally different language than the CEO. The CFO is the fiduciary of the organization. The CLO is the statutory risk of the organization. The HR person, if they're good, is the organizational strength expert of the organization, how to make that culture a leading innovative and leadership culture. And what is the language of the risk, resilience, security profession, right? So you have to define what your language is and how it intersects what the Berlitz translation is to each other member of the room. And by the way, you're not alone. You think the sales executive understands the language of the CFO and CLO or the COO? So we already have this problem in business. It's not unusual for people not to understand your language. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And those are really great points. I feel like, well, I don't feel like anything. I know for a fact that the security industry in general does not view itself as a business vertical within the organization. It views itself as a quite necessary cost center. And we provide value for times like these. But John, how do we go about thinking about the actual value that we bring the organization the other 90% of the time when we're not in crisis? What are your thoughts on that?
Hit on it, and I've harkened back to my personal experience when being on a senior leadership team for the first time and being really one of the first security professionals in that room, and listening to the presentations by the VP of operations and the CFO, and writing down in my book EBITDA ? So all these businesses. So I'm wrapping up my MBA now. So now I know what they mean. But at the time, I used to keep this running language of all these business acronyms, but I had no idea what they meant. And so that translator.
You were looking in the directory for someone named EBITDA. You thought he was Italian.
Guy.
Absolutely.
He's super important. He's super important. And so, but once I realized what they were and started to kind of translate where my organization, it actually started, I was also responsible for international trade compliance, and we went through this brilliant exercise and I worked for an aerospace and defense company. So you and I talked about this, Ron, kind of the lean processes, that Six Sigma application, and how that can be mapped across to business, and that intersects with the ESRM stuff that Tim, you and I work on. And so we applied that in international trade compliance. And then I looked at that and said, this is like, before I really knew what ESRM was, I said, well, we can do this in security too. So let's sit down and talk to the supply chain person and ask them, like, what are the things that matter most to you? We didn't say, what does security need to know? We didn't say, what's keeping you up at night? That buzzword that our industry loves to toss at people, and the top 5 things keeping up CEOs. We said, what matters most to supply chain? Well, getting our stuff in and out. Perfect. How can we protect that? And then so we started to do that intersection, and then we could speak to the language of each individual stakeholder and start translating and understanding the culture of those functions, because the culture of finance, that's probably one of the most unique functions, I think, that has like its own culture. The culture of finance is unique. The culture of HR is unique. And the CEO has to play with all those cultures too. So it's an interesting dynamic. And I think just acknowledging it and embracing it and not being afraid to get involved with it and to learn about it, Ron, I think is like the number one thing, like not being afraid of the different. And you can stay inside your office and shut the door and just work on security stuff all day, or you can ask the business. We always hear about getting a seat at the table, getting a seat at the C-suite. Well, you can't get a seat there if you don't learn about why you need to be there and what they're doing there, and how to like get involved in that conversation. And I think that to me, just getting curious is the first step.
Hashtag, you can't have a seat at the table if you don't belong.
Very good.
So
I like that.
You brought up a really interesting perspective, John, that I didn't think that we were going to talk about in this conversation, but I think we're going to go there. We tell you YPs coming into the security industry, you need to find a mentor to learn how to navigate the industry. As security professionals, especially if you're embedded in a corporate security department within a company, why don't we go and find business mentors that can help us integrate and understand the business and sound like the business, to understand the business? It was kind of fun and not so fun when I first got into technology, because I knew nothing about technology, but I was on some really critical projects. And I found one engineer who I'm friends with to this day, who would sit next to me in these meetings, and they would be talking, I thought it was a security meeting, they're talking about port whatever and blah, 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 blah. And I was just like, I'm owning this project. I have no idea what you're talking about. And he would be like, hey, do you want it to work this way? Do you want it to work that way? And we'd have a little sidebar conversation. They'd be like, blah, blah, blah. And he became a mentor to me, but also a key partner, because he saw the value of the project and he saw I was trying to learn and this was not my skill set. And he took on that role to help me be successful. Yeah. Ron, how do we grab a mentor in the business to help us become that business vertical and recognize that, be recognized for that value?
Well, first of all, I want to expand on your point a little bit. I'm going to actually take you on a slightly different path than identifying a mentor. I'm going to suggest what I suggest to people just entering their careers. And that is, but first let me ask you a question. Why does the CEO have a board of directors?
Absolutely. Because he needs advisors that represent subject matter experts around him to help him understand the big picture.
That's true. Why else does he need a board of directors? There's another reason. And if Lee was on the phone, because he's an entrepreneur like me, the second reason is to actually penetrate markets. So if you think of yourself as an entity for a second, Tim, which you should, I coached my children on this as they were entering the workplace, you need to assemble a board of directors that does three things. One, gives you subject matter expertise in core disciplines, right? Has been there before, so knows how to hold me accountable to my own mission, vision, and goals. And third, help me penetrate new markets. What's your new market inside Facebook? It's getting to the next step in your career, right? And getting a larger budget for the things that are truly innovative. And so I say, no, not a mentor. You need a board of directors, and you need to choose wisely inside and outside the company to be able to fulfill the mission of a good board.
Actually, my current manager advocates for all of his managers that are under him to do this very thing, to put together a board, internal and external.
Right.
So I mean, you probably learned it from him. So we'll just like hashtag, him in the comments, but
yeah,
it's a great idea though. It's very helpful.
The other, yeah, I went through a similar, just to hammer that on that point, Ron. This can be attributed to many different authors, whether it's Napoleon Hill or Covey, or make your list of people who said it, but you're the summation of the 6 people you hang out with the most or whatever. And
right.
And I was reflecting on that about a year ago and looking at really that outside of my work colleagues, that I did not really have friends, a social network in the way that I once had in college and early careerhood, because I'd gotten so busy. I'm family, married, 4 kids, career kind of on full blast, and it's where am I getting this other part of my life? So I reached out to a couple of my college lacrosse colleagues and who had been successful in their own right and kind of running that same path, and put myself out there and said, hey guys, I don't really have a lot of friends anymore. I don't have any, we text with each other and we stay in touch, but when's the last time we all got together? And so we put together this group, and it ended up being about 12 of us, and the group kind of flexes, but 6 of us routinely get together and have become each other's board of advisors. And it ranges from, the youngest one is freshly married. We all played lacrosse together over about a 6-year period that we were in school and kind of touched each other's careers, playing careers. But, I was a little bit older because I was in the Army. So some of these guys are, 8 years younger than me. But their perspective is amazingly unique, of learning about all right, you're 10 years behind me, but if I could do it over again, what would you, tell me what I'm missing. And one of them's the CEO of his own marketing company, very successful entrepreneur. So I asked him, if I was curious about doing that myself, what are the things that you do? And so I kind of chose a little tighter to say people I already knew, but really respected their opinions and wanted to kind of fill in my blind spots and have people who I knew would be honest with me and just really stretch my thought and conversation. So I guess for those watching, it doesn't have to be this grandiose, I'm going to go out and get the CEO and an ops VP and all these famous people. Maybe it's just a couple of guys that or that you can talk to that will be honest with you and are truth tellers that can help you, find that next path for yourself.
The other thing I always like to do in my professional career, in my life, is I said change is the only constant, and I said fear of change is probably the greatest weakness you can have. There's a third thing too, and if I use this metaphor, hopefully no one gets freaked out here. If I can use this, opportunity. Remember, I said the CEO's language is the equation of risk balancing risk and opportunity for strategic value. Remember I said that? And all of you on the phone maybe went right to risk because that's your domain, but you're not good opportunity people. And here's what I've learned about opportunity, and here's the weird analogy or metaphor, if you will, that's going to freak people out. Opportunity is a jealous God. Now hang on to that for a second. That is, if you don't pay attention to her, she will go somewhere else. Opportunity is a jealous God. So when you're grasping the idea change is a constant, and that I'm looking at ways to lead to the next level of value, including challenging or disrupting the very things I've learned and the old notions of what I do, pay attention to the opportunity and don't be shy in grabbing it, because opportunity is a jealous God and it will go somewhere else. And those of us entrepreneurs know that. We know there's a window of every opportunity. And if I don't hit that window, someone else will. Does that make sense?
That's a great point. I totally understand it. And so I'd like to follow up with a question. For us that have come from the military, from the government, whose business acumen maybe isn't as great as it should be, we're just learning it now that we're in the private sector. How do we, A, recognize opportunities, and B, feel like we're not stepping out of our lane? So in the military and the government, they say, stay in your lane. This is what you're here to do. It's very predefined. In the private sector, you have to be much more entrepreneurial, right? You have to find your opportunities. You have to expand your programs in ways that provide value to the company. So how can we get over that feeling of I'm stepping outside of my lane, I'm doing something wrong?
Because you're business people, not security people. Remember, I told you that? At the end of the day, I think both of you said it best. You belong at the table. Now you got to show it. Can you intersect with their language? Can you interpret their language? Can you interpret what is germane as every one of those people at the table? Remember I said speaking all the different languages at the United Nations? Mm-hmm. Guess how they execute? And you're going to love this, John, being kind of a Six Sigma guy too. They have to deploy people to perform a role in a process using whatever tools we decide will help optimize that process and that role, right? So technology. So people perform roles in a process, a measurable process using technology. The problem is, in our industry, our risk resilient security industry, how often do we have truly measurable processes and roles? So if I was just explaining to another company in another industry, I said, one of your biggest challenges as I advise them on their business is you're doing nothing to establish a baseline at all for your customers. And without a baseline, they will never know your value, right? So what is the baseline that you can speak the language of the rest of the members of the executive team? What's that baseline that you can begin to show measurable value using risk as one of your levers, right? And it's all over the place. It's all over the place.
Follow-up question there. I think metrics and measurability is a fleeting objective for our industry. If you pull old ASIS guidelines that have been written up about metrics or surveys that they've done, it's things like time to create badges or access level creation or door throughput. What are your thoughts on that? Some practical, and we don't have to dig too deep into it, but walk me through the process when you're guiding a company, and we can stay agnostic to industry for a second, and then we can dig down into how it might help security professionals. What should organizations look at when they try to identify what are the things they should be measuring? How do they set that baseline?
Okay. Now, are you saying organizations, or are you saying a security program?
Should there be a difference?
Okay. Well, first of all, what I love about your remark, John, on should it be a difference, there is, if you're only talking to your team, and where I used to, one of the opening questions I had early on in this industry, because I was trying to figure out, I like to get to root cause. So I started polling on this. I started saying, tell me how you capture my identity as a new employee. Because you're trying to keep people from getting in, right? With this card of yours. So how do you capture identity? Take me through that process. Am I filling out a form in HR and then you're grabbing that form and you're plugging it into the car? How are you capturing identity? The next question was, does identity have a process in other domains? Where else does identity show up? And I didn't realize that I had opened up a can of worms, because I started finding out that identity was all in these different caches all around the company. There was no federated identity. Well, that is an opportunity and a risk, isn't it, Tim and John? It's both an opportunity and a risk, because that's what we do. One of the things we do is we touch on that identity. So that's a good example of, again, ideation thinking, imagination thinking. Change is always a constant. What can I be doing to help my role in identity get leveraged in a more powerful way throughout the organization? And you're seeing it now in the middle of the pandemic. We're now being faced with this idea that sickness is a weapon. HR knew sickness was a cost. Did you know that? HR knew sickness was a cost. And that's why they have wellness programs. But you guys never grabbed onto it to say, wait, if sickness costs us money and sickness can cause death, what's the definition of your role? To protect the company and its assets and the employees and the goals and missions of the company? Where were you in keeping sickness out of the door? Why did it take an influenza called COVID to manage sickness? Pretty interesting. That's innovation thinking, right?
That's a really solid point. I think as security professionals, we fail to ask the basic questions because we're afraid of looking stupid. Like, what is sickness? What are the components of it? Even to the point of what are the components of somebody getting into this door without it alarming, right? We try to get from 0 to high speed so that everything looks polished and flashy and we can talk the talk, but we neglect the basic components of anything that we're working on. We neglect to define them to ourselves. We neglect to help the business define them as they relate to us, because we think that the business knows better. But when it comes to the relationships with security, the business is as clueless as I was about technology when I got in. They have to learn, and who's going to teach them?
That is so transparent of you. And we're back to fear again. Remember the first truth, the fear of
It's
shame.
all about fear.
Fear of shame, fear of fear of that I'm going to look stupid. I asked a very basic question very early on 20 years ago. One of the other basic questions was not only, if I go to the CEO and I say, is security mission critical to your business? What will they say? And the question had never been asked. Because I asked, what would he say? Not what would you say? And, usually they go to what they say, which is, they must not value us. We don't have a seat at the table. We don't get enough, but no, I don't want that. I'm going to go to your CEO and ask, is security mission critical? Not you. And what's he going to say?
And the reason that was never asked is because whoever was in charge of security probably thought they would say no and then say, oh, I'm out of a job, instead of tugging on that thread to say, why do you feel that way? How about in this vector? How about in this vector? What about when these types of things happen? What is our role? And often the business hasn't thought it out. They take security for granted. Like when you call 911, you take for granted the police will be there. But
Right.
depending on what's going on, depending on how well organized things are, they may not be. And it's the same with the security department.
So one of the
I think
things,
it's also just the fear of the answer, right? You don't want to know the answer to that.
Well,
You don't want to know that.
I'll give you a great one, especially with high tech being so pervasive in our culture now. You've heard of fail fast, right?
Mhm.
Fail fast is,
Yeah,
I think, it was originally the phrase came from Google, I think. The whole idea that we'll throw something out there. If it fails, that's fine, because we just learned something. So one of the things I ask, because I come from high tech, one of the things I would ask security people is, I don't see you going to the ideal. And they go, what do you mean? I go, if an incident is occurring, don't you want to have a goal of responding in real time to that incident? Because I never hear you talking about that. Well, that's impossible. Well, it certainly is if it's never in your roadmap. So how do you respond to an incident, a risk in real time, a risk to a real person, to an asset, to a territory, to a region? How are you responding to a risk in real time? And they hadn't asked that question because they thought it was impossible. And that's why we have video cameras on a wall. First, we've got to see it. I'm a Six Sigma guy, remember, John? First, a person performing a role in a process has to see it. And then Deming would say, the statistical process control guy would say, now, how many human touch points does it take before we get to our goal of responding to the incident or disrupting it? Oh, wait, if we can respond in real time, we're disrupting the incident. We're not just responding to it forensically with a video camera, right? So it starts the innovation thinking. How can we get nearer to real time? More guards? I guess. Is there other ways we can respond in real time? So those are the kind of things I want to see more out of this next generation that you guys are capturing. By the way, love you guys, because I remember a little bit of an entrepreneurial streak in me. I always like to say, be the tail that wags the dog. So you're not the dog yet, but if this next generation can be the tail that wags the dog, I love you guys. That's like igniting a fire.
So Ron, in that vein, so we're in an industry that's main objective is to mitigate, reduce risk, to control with security, to make things safer. The thinking you're talking about, the failing fast, the kind of innovative thinking, has to accept risk as a playground where they're willing to run. How do we rationalize this? How do we accept stretch assignments, stretch projects where we're saying, I want to try to reduce it to zero, even though I know that's hard, and if I sign up for it, I might be held accountable to it. It's like when Alan Mulally took over at GM and kind of said, we're going to do things that, kind of just totally disrupted their mentality. No, this is a car, you don't understand. Well, you should try planes. That's complicated. Cars are easy. They can't fall out of the sky, right? So how do you get our industry to see itself in a different way?
Oh, by the way, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Early on, Deming, those of you who want to look him up, Deming was the father of statistical process control, but more importantly, he actually was trying to sell his approach, which was total quality management, by the way, that said 80% of the cost of anything is driven in the first 20% of the process. So the quality of the product is defined in the first 20% of the process. And he tries to go to the motor companies in his backyard back in the 30s, 40s, right? And they did back to good is the enemy of great. They go, that's a decimal point. And by the way, the customer will pay for it on the service end. Why would we care about a perfect product, an ideal scenario of 100% zero defects? Why would we even do that, even if it was possible? Good is the enemy of great. So So it wasn't possible for them. So when we beat the Japanese and we invoked the Marshall Plan to rebuild Japan instead of just squishing them, we actually set out to rebuild Japan. The Japanese invited Deming over. 30 years later, what was happening? Japanese were kicking our butts, right?
Yep.
30 years later, they were kicking our butts because they had 0 defects, right? Compared to the American products. And it's a new playing field now because that became the scorecard for a car, right? A new scorecard.
Absolutely.
And I always like to talk to security professionals and business people about who owns the scorecard. And I always like to turn to security professionals and go, you do. So if you're trying to measure things, you've got to understand how to develop scorecards, don't you?
Absolutely. And it's been such a good conversation, a great conversation maybe. And, but you know, we've kind of tied up a couple points here, whereas John was asking about how to create metrics and you're talking about being that consultant to the business, asking those questions, those foundational questions, pulling on those threads. What if we could get to real-time response? Are we a critical function of the business? Why or why not? Those create metrics that will matter to the C-suite as you track them. You said this, and I asked you how we would become a critical business function. You said, well, if you could accomplish these things or provide this, and now you can track
Yes.
those movements forward. That's a great place to start on actioning difficult feedback.
You have the baseline. Remember, we started with you have the baseline. You've got to construct the baseline and get everyone's agreement on action that it is the baseline. So you've heard this over and over in the industry in different webinars and seminars and great conversations, you know, where enlightened CSOs go, my customer is each of the functional business units in a company who actually own the risk as well as the opportunity for their function. And they'll tell you, you've got to learn how to interview them. You've got to learn the art of the question so that you can get to what? The baseline of risk and opportunity in each one of those foreign countries that make up the United Nations.
And Ron, as you're talking about the business, you know, us as business people, security professionals as business people, is it an oversimplification for a security leader to look at his or her organization as their own company, and their company, as you talked about, the stakeholders, as their clients, their customers, and that they need to sell them security day in and day out? That's their product. That's the service and the product that they're creating. And they need to go get voice of the customer, find out what their needs are, how they meet those needs, track that. I mean, is it that simple? Am I oversimplifying it to say, take your typical business practices and principles, apply it to a security program, turn it inside out to your corporation, and there you go. You have it. You just need to embrace it. Is that oversimplifying?
So those of you in the consulting business, John's email, if you want to recruit him, is a great consultant. Knows how to do that, knows how to ask the right questions. First of all, knows how to get in the door, and also knows how to ask the right questions that tease out how they define risk and opportunity. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think this is a key thing to reflect upon in the security industry. I came from the medical industry. I was a paramedic. I was an Army medic. And my full-time job for 12 years was working on the ambulance. Every day, I did the same thing, no matter what the situation, over and over and over again. Why did you call me a day? What hurts? Does it hurt when? Does it hurt how? How bad? What's the root cause? Test, results.
Yeah.
Root cause, treatment plan. And that type of assessment mindset of how do we whittle it down to what's actually causing the pain rather than just the symptoms that we often chase in the security industry, which is one of the reasons why we don't have credibility with the business. It never seems to work. Well, because once one symptom gets better, the others are amplified because we're not actually tackling the root causes. And I think it brings us to a point that I'd like to hit on. How often does a business trust security? Ron, as we were talking about this conversation, you asked John and I a question. Hey, the guy watching the camera, if he sees something going on, can he lock down the campus on his own without any authority? And we were like, no, nobody trusts him to do that. And why is that? So how do we become, trusted advisors to the business? How do we change our mindset, Ron?
So let's genericize this a little bit. How does any good executive earn trust? Instead of making this about security, because I'm treating you like business people, how does any good executive earn trust?
I would say vision and results.
Yeah.
I would say owning failures and remediating them.
Yeah. It's really interesting. As you know, I brought in for the first time to the last great conversation a organizational psychologist, right? Most security people don't get the chance to actually deal interactively with one of the top 30 organizational consultants. And
or
what,
probably afraid
and
of talking to a psychologist.
And well, these are the people CEOs turn to do what's near and dear to their hearts, the enlightened CEOs, the CEOs that are trying to create powerful, compelling, engaged workforces, a culture of innovation and change, right? An adaptable culture. Yeah, not everyone is enlightened as a CEO, but the ones that do need that kind of DNA coming in and saying, let's get a baseline of where your culture is today, what level of engagement, right? But what he is teaching us really at the end of the day is how to create a trust fabric. Business people, and I include you in that. So basically the path to doing so is to learn how to create a relationship. And that's not done through pontification. And how I read the current 20 years ago, how I read the consultants out there, both internally and externally in the risk, resilience, and security industry, is I'm going to collect data, crime reports, right? I have all these traditional ways I think about risk, but none of it was around the actual business process of the key levers of the company, right? So if you want to earn trust, you got to learn how a company operates, or the division you're trying to get into to advise on risk. How does HR operate? What's their key KPIs? And so I would have no problem if I had entered the workforce as a security person playing, you're not old enough for this. There used to be a guy on TV called Columbo. He was a private detective, and he'd come off
Love that show.
And he asked really stupid questions, right? And he'd pull out of the perp, eventually what the truth was. I asked stupid questions. Can I have 30 minutes of your time, back to your board of directors? Can I have 30 minutes of your time? I just like to ask some ways you think about HR. That's it. Not about security. Learn how they operate. What are their KPIs? What are the business basic constraints to the way they organize their people in roles, in a process, using what technology? What are the things that get in their way? What is the greatest risk to their KPIs? Without saying
I think you touched on something that I think is truly has the opportunity to be truly transformational in our industry, and that is showing your organization, all organizations, anybody, the value that a security professional and a security group can bring to a company, and making that transformation from a line item on the P&L to a value creation a value creator, so that if I can, using HR as an example, if I know where their pinch points are, using one, like the return to work process that you have for people coming off of LOA, right? Who lets people in the door? Me. Who can check and confirm that when the people come in, they've gotten cleared off of LOA to come back to RTW to make sure you don't have somebody who has a restriction on the production floor. You know how much headache that causes for HR and paperwork and stuff they have to do? Like, that's a simple process that security can control and be a backstop for HR if you just went and talked to them and said, what's the thing that causes you the most heartache? And I think that's where, that's just one simple example, but you can do 10 of those for every function and start creating that internal value and being seen as a partner.
Hey, here's what I learned as a business person about trust. I started realizing the people I trusted most in the room were not the type of people who prescribed. These were the people who were asking the right questions of me. Ooh, if they were asking the best questions of me, I inferred, it was really interesting. I go, I'm answering, but I'm inferring he's smart enough to ask the right questions. He's probably a guy I want to talk to about the right answers. So what I would say to each of the next generation is learn how to ask the right questions without the intent of solving them.
And as an industry, we see ourselves as first responders and problem solvers, and we need to get out of our own way, out of our own role in this environment. It's funny, this is our second episode, and we could probably call this, instead of GSD Talks, we could probably call it there's no security in security, we're all insecure, because it keeps coming back to I'm afraid of doing the wrong thing. I don't feel like I belong here. I feel like I'm going to step out of my lane. What if, how if, when? And, going back to my experience coming into tech, I actually didn't know anything about the technology side of the projects I had been tasked to lead, but I did ask questions. I took others' partnership. I said, hey, I'm responsible for this, but I can't do this without you guys. So we need to come together and find out what success looks like for myself, but also for the organization. So this project can be done well and not redone in the future, which is also a symptom of security. So I was wondering if you guys have any closing comments to close this issue out.
John, you want to go first?
Let me touch off here, and then Ron, you can close it. So I think, from my perspective, again, we've only gotten a microcosm of the larger conversation that the three of us had, but I think we've hit on, in preparation for this, but hit on some of the very poignant topics here. And I think the kind of one key takeaway from this for me that I have is about learning from the non-security folks that you interact with, and not just from like, I want to know what you do, but the culture of what they do. We didn't really touch on this, but as a global organization, many of us are a part of, like Facebook and the companies I've been at, it's not just about the functions, but it's also about where they are. So like Tim, you interact with people all over the globe on your team. So how do you connect with the cultures of different countries and different religions and different people and make that part of the conversation, and being okay with differences and actually using differences as an amplifier to make a better performing team. And we don't all have to be the same and think the same. Actually, if we do that, it's a detriment to our performance. And using the simple business principles that we talked about, Ron, and not being afraid to apply them to security, or different ones, like whatever, don't be afraid to try something new, to fail fast, to experiment and learn from your failures. And I think that is something that our industry can embrace, and then can really short circuit our ability to move faster.
And I'll actually piggyback, knowing that this is a conversation we'll probably have later, but a famous quote attributed to Drucker, one of the famous business leaders of all time, attributed, not sure he actually said it, was culture eats strategy for breakfast. It was a great line, because what he was reinforcing, and by the way, culture isn't just a corporate culture. It's also a divisional culture, as you stated. And it's also, by the way, a personal culture. That is, I have a worldview that I've constructed over time that causes me to do things that could be dysfunctional in nature. And for those the viewers, this is recorded, but I don't know what date you're going to throw this out live, but viewers, we're coming off a weekend of fire across our cities. And we're asking, what causes a man like George Floyd to get murdered? It's called culture, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have anybody put any rules in place, any laws in place, any gun in place, but the root of this is back to the fear of the other. The fear of the other is a very, very limiting thing. And one of the biggest things you have to do, because you brought this up, you have right now, you're saying to me, I'm not saying it to you, you're telling me that most of the leaders in your industry have a fear of being wrong, a fear of being stupid. And the fear keeps them from having fierce and compelling conversations with the people who actually could provide the answer to their questions. Am I hearing that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's not just leaders, but it's the culture of the industry in general, and that fear is keeping us from being vulnerable enough to want to learn for a living.
There you go.
But hey, I'm really glad that you came on, Ron. This was excellent. It was a good conversation. If you were leading it, it was a great conversation. But hopefully we'll do something with you soon. But this will air on June 9th.
Hey, let's hand it to both of you that this is a real conversation. It wasn't an interview with me where I'm the star. This was a serious, cool roundtable, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of it. Thanks, guys.